The story unfolding around Nicolás Maduro right now is not just about a courtroom, it's about how power, legitimacy, and international pressure collide when a government is suddenly challenged from the outside. According to publicly reported information, Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, appeared in a New York court and entered not guilty pleas on all charges brought against them. But the most surprising part isn't the charges themselves, it's what their legal strategy, their public statements, and the timing of these events may reveal about what comes next for Venezuela and why the global response has been unusually cautious. Because this case isn't only about alleged crimes, it's about who gets to define authority when a country's leadership is disputed, and what happens when legal systems, diplomacy, and geopolitics intersect in real time. To understand why this moment matters, it helps to start with how unprecedented the situation appears to be. According to court reporting, Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores pleaded not guilty to all counts listed in their indictments. Prosecutors allege involvement in serious international crimes, including drug-related conspiracies and weapons offenses. The defense, however, has rejected every allegation and emphasized that these are unproven claims that must be tested in court. At the same time, Maduro has reportedly declined to seek bail and has continued to assert that he remains the legitimate president of Venezuela. That single claim adds a layer of complexity that goes far beyond a standard criminal proceeding. If someone maintains they are a sitting head of state, the case is no longer just legal, it becomes diplomatic, political, and symbolic. This is where the story begins to widen. Legal experts note that cases involving former or disputed leaders often move slowly, not because of the evidence alone, but because of the implications. Every decision where the defendants are held, how proceedings are conducted, even how language is used in court can carry international consequences. Adding to that complexity, attorneys for the couple have stated that Maduro has ongoing medical issues that require attention, and that Flores experienced physical distress during the events leading up to their transfer to the United States. These claims, like all others, remain part of the legal process and have not been independently verified in court at this stage. What is clear is that the transfer itself has drawn global attention. Reports indicate that U.S. forces detained Maduro and Flores over the weekend and transported them to New York, where they made their first court appearances. Video footage later showed them being escorted by federal agents between secure facilities. Officials have been careful in how these images were presented, avoiding unnecessary spectacle. But the symbolism was impossible to ignore. For supporters of the charges, the images represented accountability. For critics, they raised serious questions about sovereignty and international precedent, and that divide is exactly why this case refuses to stay confined to a courtroom. Meanwhile, developments inside Venezuela were moving just as quickly. Following Maduro's removal, reports suggest that Vice President Delcy Rodríguez was sworn in as acting president. The transition, while described as orderly by some sources, has been met with uncertainty both domestically and internationally. When asked publicly about the situation, U.S. President Donald Trump commented that Rodríguez was picked by Maduro, a statement that, intentionally or not, highlighted the ambiguity surrounding the transfer of power. Was this a continuation of the same system or the beginning of something new? That question matters, because legitimacy isn't just about who holds office, it's about who is recognized, by whom, and under what conditions. And this is where the case becomes less about allegations and more about consequences. International observers point out that Venezuela has existed in a prolonged state of political tension for years, with competing claims to leadership and deep divisions among global powers. What makes this moment different is the physical presence of the former leader in a foreign legal system, facing charges that carry global implications. Some analysts argue this could deter future alleged misconduct by powerful figures. Others warn it could escalate tensions and create instability if not handled carefully. Both perspectives rely on the same unresolved issue: how the trial unfolds. Because the outcome of this case may influence not only Venezuela's internal future, but also how international law is applied to leaders whose authority is contested. And that raises a much larger question, one that hasn't been answered yet. If courts decide one thing, but politics decides another, Which decision actually shapes reality? That question becomes even more important when we look at what may happen next inside the courtroom, inside Venezuela, and across the international community. And that's where the story takes its next turn. As the legal process moves forward, attention is shifting from what has already happened to what these proceedings could realistically lead to. According to publicly available legal commentary, the charges outlined against Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores are among the most serious ever brought against a foreign political figure in a U.S. court. Prosecutors argue that the case is built on long-term investigations and international cooperation. Defense attorneys, however, maintain that the accusations are politically motivated and lack credible jurisdiction. This disagreement is not unusual, but the stakes here are, in most criminal cases, guilt or innocence is the central question. In this one, legitimacy runs parallel to the legal debate. Maduro's continued assertion that he remains Venezuela's president is not merely rhetorical. It is a strategic position that could influence how evidence is framed, how immunity arguments are raised, and how international actors respond. Legal scholars point out that U.S. courts generally avoid recognizing claims of immunity when the executive branch does not recognize the individual as a legitimate head of state. But that determination exists outside the courtroom, shaped by diplomatic recognition rather than legal precedent alone, which means the courtroom is reacting to decisions made elsewhere. This explains why language matters so much in this case. Prosecutors have reportedly avoided emotionally charged framing, sticking closely to procedural facts. Defense filings emphasize due process, medical considerations, and alleged mistreatment, while stopping short of inflammatory claims. That careful balance is intentional, because the moment the case appears driven by spectacle rather than procedure, its credibility weakens, not just legally, but globally. At the same time, developments inside Venezuela continue to complicate the picture. Reports suggest that Delcy Rodríguez's swearing-in was presented as a temporary and stabilizing measure. Government-aligned media framed it as continuity, while opposition voices questioned whether the transition had any constitutional foundation. International responses have ranged from cautious acknowledgement to deliberate silence. Silence, in this context, is not neutrality, it is strategy. Many governments appear to be waiting to see how the trial unfolds before taking a firm position. Recognition, sanctions, and diplomatic engagement may all hinge on whether the legal case progresses smoothly or encounters procedural challenges. And then there is the humanitarian dimension. Venezuela's population has endured years of economic strain, migration pressures, and institutional uncertainty. Analysts warn that prolonged ambiguity at the top of government could worsen existing challenges if administrative authority becomes fragmented or contested. This is why some international organizations have called for restraint in rhetoric and clarity in process. The goal, according to these statements, is to prevent legal proceedings from triggering broader instability. But restraint does not mean inaction. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels are reportedly active. Discussions are said to involve not just the United States and Venezuela, but regional governments, international courts, and multilateral organizations. Each actor has different priorities: accountability, stability, precedent, or influence. That creates a situation where every move is interpreted through multiple lenses. For supporters of the prosecution, the case represents a rare moment where alleged wrongdoing by powerful individuals is addressed through formal legal mechanisms. For critics, it raises concerns about selective enforcement and geopolitical imbalance. Both interpretations exist simultaneously, and neither can be dismissed outright. What happens next will likely depend on procedural milestones rather than dramatic revelations. Pre-trial motions, jurisdictional challenges, evidentiary hearings. These are not headline-grabbing events, but they determine the trajectory of the entire case. And they take time, which leads to an uncomfortable reality. The most consequential outcomes may occur far from public view, in filings, negotiations, and diplomatic statements that receive little attention. Yet their impact could be long-lasting. If the court allows the case to proceed without interruption, it may signal a shift in how international criminal accountability is enforced. If the case stalls or is dismissed on technical grounds, It could reinforce skepticism about the reach of legal systems across borders. Either way, the precedent matters. And while the legal process unfolds, the political question remains unresolved. Who ultimately governs Venezuela, and not just in name, but in practice? That question does not have a courtroom answer. It will be shaped by recognition, internal governance, and the ability to maintain institutional control. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most important part of this story, because regardless of the verdict, the implications will extend far beyond this case, and that's exactly what we need to look at next. As this case moves toward its next phase, one reality becomes increasingly clear: the verdict itself may not be the most influential outcome. History shows that trials involving disputed leaders often reshape international behavior long before a judge or jury reaches a conclusion. The process of how it unfolds, how it is perceived, and how consistently rules are applied can matter just as much as the final decision. In this situation, Nicolás Maduro's continued insistence that he remains Venezuela's president functions less as a legal argument and more as a political signal. It reinforces loyalty among some supporters, complicates recognition abroad, and forces other governments to choose their language carefully. Even neutral phrasing can be interpreted as endorsement or rejection. That alone changes the diplomatic landscape. At the same time, Delcy Rodríguez's reported assumption of the presidency places Venezuela in a delicate position. Transitional leadership can provide short-term stability, but it also invites scrutiny. Foreign governments, financial institutions, and international organizations often hesitate to commit resources or recognition until authority is clearly established. This creates a pause, one filled with uncertainty. Analysts note that prolonged uncertainty tends to shift power away from formal institutions and toward informal networks, emergency measures, or external influence. That risk is why some observers argue that transparency and consistency in both legal and political processes are critical in the coming months. Not because they guarantee a positive outcome, but because they reduce the likelihood of unintended consequences. Another factor shaping the future is precedent. If this case proceeds smoothly, it may influence how international justice is pursued against powerful figures accused of cross-border crimes. It could encourage cooperation between legal systems, or at least clarify the conditions under which such cases are possible. If it does not, the opposite lesson may be taken. Either interpretation will be studied closely, and not just by governments, but by leaders watching how authority, accountability, and protection interact on the global stage. And while much of the focus remains on court filings and official statements, the human dimension should not be overlooked. For millions of Venezuelans, political transitions are not abstract concepts. They affect access to services, economic stability, and the ability to plan for the future. This is why many international responses emphasize caution over celebration, and process over punishment. Because stability, once lost, is difficult to restore. So where does this leave the story right now? It leaves us at a crossroads where law, politics, and perception intersect. A courtroom in New York may determine legal responsibility, but Venezuela's future will depend on recognition, governance, and the ability of institutions to function under pressure. And that outcome is still being written. What happens next won't be decided in a single ruling or announcement. It will emerge through a series of procedural steps, diplomatic choices, and political responses, each shaping the next chapter. The real question is not only whether justice is pursued, but how it is pursued, and what message that process sends to the rest of the world. In the next video, we'll look more closely at how international recognition works during leadership disputes, and why some governments choose silence while others take a public stand. Because in moments like this, what countries don't say can matter just as much as what they do.